Just a short introduction of Mr. Stephen Heifetz. Prior to joining Stepto, he is currently the partner of Stepto & Johnson's LLP. He served in the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security, as well as the Central Intelligence Agency. And in his most recent government position, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Policy Development at the Department of Homeland Security.
Thanks very much, Dietrich. So, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a nice Saturday. I'm going to focus here on Chinese investment and national security, and really we're at that intersection where the rubber meets the road is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS. I served on the committee for about 4 years. It was very interesting work, and have remained involved in that practice while at the law firm. It's a terrible name for a committee, by the way. I'll spare you the various CFIUS jokes, but my wife cringes every time I talk about what the work that I did. The committee operates against a backdrop of U.S. open investment policy. This has been, the U.S. open investment policy has been the policy of the United States for a very long time. It was first formally stated by President Reagan, recently restated by President Obama, and the gist of the policy is, as it sounds, the United States welcomes foreign investment. There's bountiful research, some of it by folks here, showing that foreign FDI is economically beneficial. And so the United States welcomes foreign investment and treats foreign investors fairly. That's the gist of the policy. CFIUS operates with that as the background. CFIUS is an interagency committee chaired by the Treasury Department. I'll get in a minute to some of the details about CFIUS. But it is CFIUS's policy, too, that foreign investment is a good thing. And though CFIUS has the mandate to review foreign investment in the United States for national security implications, the committee does not try to block transactions. That's not its goal in any event. The goal is to make sure that investments continue but don't adversely affect national security, and where the committee has concerns about an investment, their preference is to try to mitigate those concerns through what's generally called a risk mitigation agreement, rather than blocking the deal. Let's see. This slide you've seen before, I think, so I'll skip this, other than to note that significant Chinese direct investment in the United States is a very recent phenomenon. So CFIUS is really just starting to grapple with how do you deal with a very significant, important trading partner that also is a source of tension from a security standpoint. And the next slide is illustrative of some of these security concerns. Just last month, for the first time publicly, a senior administration official, the National Security Advisor, made some fairly pointed comments indicating that the administration was looking to the Chinese government to get a handle on cyber intrusions and allegations of theft of confidential business information that was preceded in the previous month by a widely publicized report alleging that the Chinese government sponsors cyber espionage. And then in the fall, again widely publicized report by the House Intelligence Committee pointing fingers specifically at two Chinese companies, Huawei and ZTE, as national security risks. And then earlier that fall, a case that had bubbled up within CFIUS and was referred to the president, a case where a Chinese company acquired some wind farms in Oregon close to a DOD facility, and the president ultimately ordered that divested. The quote at the bottom of the slide is to suggest that really, if you take a step back, it doesn't, for our analytical purposes, whether you think that there are threats, there are risks, national security risks or not, and reasonable people disagree about that, for the present and for the foreseeable future, the U.S. government is quite concerned, at least about certain types of investments, certain direct investments, and where people perceive situations to be real, they have real consequences, and those consequences often play out in CFIUS in particular. What is CFIUS? Again, it's an interagency committee, meaning that there are multiple U.S. government agencies that participate in reviewing foreign investments. The committee is chaired by the Department of the Treasury. On the security side of the aisle, that is the agencies that are really zeroed in, that are sort of hawkish and focused on U.S. national security, it's largely the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Justice. To some extent, depending on the deal, the Department of Energy can be either security-focused or more focused on the pro-trade and investment side. The Department of State typically is a booster on the trade and diplomacy side. The Department of Commerce, the U.S. Trade Representative, and these agencies sit down and they review, representatives from these agencies sit down on at least a weekly basis in person, and then there's a lot of communication that happens outside of those meetings, and they go over each of the deals that are in front of them. What deals are in front of them? Well, CFIUS reviews, has jurisdiction, has authority over transactions where a foreign entity will have control of a U.S. business, where the transaction will yield foreign control of the U.S. business. Now, from a CFIUS perspective, a U.S. business is any business that has operations in the United States. Doesn't have to be incorporated in the United States, doesn't have to have a U.S. parent. In fact, one of the most famous or infamous CFIUS cases in the last decade was the Dubai Ports World case, not a Chinese acquisition, but a UAE state-owned, well-recognized, well-respected ports management company that acquired a UK company called Peninsula and Oriental Steam Company. That company had a subsidiary, North American subsidiary, that ran ports in major U.S. cities. So it doesn't have to, the point is, it doesn't have to be a U.S. parent. If it has operations in the U.S., that is a U.S. business from CFIUS's perspective. What is control? Control is very, very broadly defined by CFIUS. Even less than 10% equity stake can be control. What CFIUS is asking with its control test is, does the foreign entity, at the end of the day, have the ability to cause a company or influence a company to act in a particular way, or to prevent a company from acting in a particular way? So veto rights or voting arrangements that will, in effect, enable the foreign entity to prevent a company from doing something, that will constitute control from CFIUS's perspective. Now, so any transaction where a foreign entity could exercise control is a covered transaction, meaning CFIUS could exercise its authorities, but they don't exercise their authorities over investments typically in a candy manufacturer or a blue jean company. They are concerned with transactions that touch national security. A long time ago, that was more narrowly understood to be largely defense companies. In the last 10 to 15 years, the aperture has broadened significantly so that it's far more than defense companies. Transportation infrastructure, biotech, certainly any telecom, high tech. You have to think very broadly about what U.S. from the perspective of transacting parties. Got to think broadly about what might U.S. government be concerned about from a national security perspective. Still, relatively small percentage of FDI, particularly by dollar volume, is reviewed by CFIUS. Historically, it's been roughly 10%. There is no requirement to file a case with CFIUS, to file a transaction with CFIUS. In the first instance, it is left to the transacting parties to decide for themselves whether their transaction results in foreign control and touches national security. But there are some fairly significant incentives to be careful about that, particularly today. First, the President has statutory authority to block a transaction or to unwind a deal once it has occurred. So in some sense, CFIUS is a safe harbor, a friend to the business community, because you can go and get your transaction approved by CFIUS in advance of closing, and then the transaction is insulated from interference from the executive branch. And virtually all cases are ultimately approved by CFIUS. We'll get to some stats about that in a little bit. Further incentive to file is that CFIUS has authority to file a case itself if the parties have not and they decide that there's a real concern there. When that happens, and it has been happening increasingly frequently, it used to be a rarity, and it now happens quite regularly every year, that's very bad news for the transacting parties, because it means CFIUS thinks there's a national security issue. They're going to presume that the parties have sought to evade a national security review, so the parties are getting off on a bad foot with CFIUS. And further, since the deal typically is done by that time, it's much harder to arrange a mitigation agreement to address the U.S. government's concerns. So transacting parties have to think very carefully, does the transaction touch on national security? A couple of comments on this slide. There are a few drivers of the number of filings which are in blue. First and foremost, it's the economy. It's the amount of M&A activity. So this roughly tracks how well the U.S. economy is performing. See the dramatic drop-off with the recession and then the recent uptick. And then the further driver is, for the blue bars, is how much CFIUS is on the radar screen as a body for deal lawyers. And so part of that growth, 2005, end of 2005, was the Dubai ports flap. That was all over the press. So you had a combination of growing economic activity and CFIUS very much on the radar screen. And then, so you have the drop-off and then growing economic activity, and also CFIUS, again, emerging on the radar screen, particularly because of recent cases involving Chinese investment that have gotten a lot of press. Most recently, the Sino-US deal, the A123 Wangsheng deal, the Rawls case, which I mentioned before, which was the presidential order of divestment. So the red bars there, and this is important for people involved in deals. It used to be that CFIUS finished up most of his cases. CFIUS makes an initial decision about a case 30 days after a deal has been filed with it. And in most of the time, still most of the time, they say after 30 days, we're done, we don't need anything further, thanks very much. It used to be very rare, when CFIUS needs additional time, they say, okay, we will proceed to an investigation. An investigation really is just an extension. It's a statement by CFIUS, we need more time to look at this. It used to be quite rare that they would go into investigation. Now it's pretty commonplace. Roughly 30 to 40% of deals go into investigation. That's the red bar, and that is problematic from the perspective of those doing a lot of deals, because if you've got a deal that you want to close, you've got a deal you want to close, and you don't want to wait an additional 45 days. That can often be a big problem. So what happens when you file with CFIUS? Well, in 80 to 90% of cases, and again, it's only a small percentage, roughly 10, 20% of FDI that's reviewed by CFIUS. In 80 to 90% of those cases, the deal is approved in the end, no problem, no commitments required. In another 10 to 20% of cases, CFIUS says, okay, we've identified some national security concerns, we've gone into investigation, we've got these concerns, we need them to be addressed, and they address them through risk mitigation agreements. These are commitments by the acquirer, almost always the acquirer, to have a security plan or a security officer who will be a liaison to the U.S. government, or to provide lists of the foreign entities' customers, to provide that list to the U.S. government on a regular basis, or to screen people in key positions, or to insist that those people in key positions be U.S. citizens. It's a wide variety of risk mitigation agreements that CFIUS sometimes requires. In rare cases, 1 or 2 cases a year, CFIUS will say, you know what, we have serious concerns, we can't figure out a way to mitigate those concerns, and we're going to recommend that the president block the deal or order divestment if the deal has already occurred. That's CFIUS's ultimate power, is to make that recommendation to the president. In virtually every case, when CFIUS is prepared to make that recommendation, the parties say, don't do that, we're going to walk away, because when that recommendation is made and the president acts, it's a public act, an issuance of an executive order, so the parties say, don't do it, we've heard you, we'll walk away from the deal. Only twice has the president actually issued a divestment order, 1990 and 2012, both involving Chinese acquisitions. What does CFIUS, when they're doing a security analysis, what do they look at? Well, 2 sets of factors. They look at what are the assets that are being acquired. This is the vulnerability assessment. How could those assets be exploited to the detriment of U.S. security? That's the vulnerability piece. And then the threat piece, which is what is the intent and capability of the acquirer? It's not only Chinese companies that get a lot of scrutiny. Israeli companies, Russian companies, Indian companies have all come under where there's a tense intelligence relationship, that is, where the U.S. intelligence community and the foreign government's intelligence community are in a tense relationship. That increases the likelihood that it's a tough CFIUS case. I've identified within the basket of what are the things looking at the assets that are being acquired, what are the factors that can drive concern. If the business has U.S. government customers, cyber vulnerabilities, proximity to security facilities, all of those things can make the vulnerability piece of the assessment more of a worry. These are things we often advise people. You've got to recognize CFIUS's broad interpretation of control and national security. It's almost always advisable to file with CFIUS. You don't want to appear to evade. Informal outreach to CFIUS agencies, sometimes long before the deal has happened. Media plan emphasizing the benefit to the U.S. of the foreign investment, particularly if it's a deal that's going to come to the attention of Congress. That becomes a very important element. Congress does its own thing. CFIUS is an executive branch creature that is more analytical, but if it's going to come to the attention of the Hill, you got to be prepared with a sort of PR effort. And then thinking long-term, companies that are making multiple investments in the United States are well advised to think strategically, perhaps make initial acquisitions that are less controversial before making acquisitions of things that are really at the core of national security. Happy to answer questions.
We will now open the question and answer session, and we will request Professor Fujin to start it, possibly with any question he has for the panelists, and also with a short comment you might possibly have on the presentations we've had. And for those who don't know who Professor Fujin is, he is the Professor of Political Economy and Executive Dean of the School of Government at Peking University. And he's also the author of Institutions and Investments, Foreign Direct Investment in China During an Era of Reform.
A very brief statement first, sort of to give a conceptual framework that I have about potential outflows of Chinese capital. Now, if we look at all Chinese firms, from intellectual firms to manufacturing to resource firms, given the stage of Chinese development in the mid of industrialization, we are not culturally and intellectually prepared to go ahead with the intellectual firms, investment banking, things like that. Manufacturing, given the stage of development, we continue to be a labor-intensive economy. So for a long time, China will be center of manufacturing. So what is left is resource-based firms. It's probably not for strategic consideration. It's an economic logic, and the data sort of support that. So it's even in the United States, it's resource-based, oil, gas, and things. Now, my question with that, my question is about the assessment of national security. National security, from the perspective of the United States, is that if we want to be secure, we need to lead in terms of the technology advantage vis-a-vis other countries for a number of years, say 5 years. For the Chinese side, to close that gap, you gain security on the Chinese side. And from the perspective of the United States, you lose on that. So for China's foreign potential foreign investment intended to close that gap, logically, it will be perceived as a security risk. And you mentioned investment from other countries like India. Suppose there is the same investment from UK, countries like UK, Canada. Do you see that as a national security risk, or laying the background, you sort of come up with the two categories of countries first? Countries like countries like Canada, countries like UK, and then countries like China, India, those who are in the business of catching up.
So to be clear, acquisitions by any foreign investor, whether Canadian, Australian, Russian, those are all subject to CFIUS review. In fact, I think the UK businesses are the most frequent CFIUS participants, and occasionally those companies have trouble, though much less frequently than Russian, Chinese, others. The national security, the threat picture, it tends not to be so much focused on staying ahead and ensuring that there is that gap. That is not usually CFIUS's focus in doing their threat assessment. What they tend to focus on is whether the foreign entity has the intent and capability to use the assets in a way that's detrimental to U.S. security in a more direct fashion. So typically with Chinese companies, the concern is ties to the Chinese government and to the PLA and the use of assets for espionage in particular, as opposed to closing technological gaps. So it is often, lots of Chinese deals go through CFIUS successfully. It happens all the time. And cases where you don't see high concerns about those links to Chinese government and assets that can be used for espionage tend to go through, even if they're transactions where you might say this would help China close the gap. So I don't think it's a zero-sum situation in the way some might suggest.
Just two very quick comments that come up from our research. On your comment that China as a whole is not ready yet to do those really high-tech transactions, I think That's probably true for the most part of China, but at the same time, we see companies like Huawei or Alibaba, Wanxiang is certainly also a case, that are very much at the cutting edge of technology and that are competitive in a global sense. And I think that's where also some of those tension points arise. And then in terms of technology investments, I think it's important that we distinguish between different degrees of technology, and what they're really targeting in the U.S. in our view is not so much those companies' societies, not so much the cutting edge of technology, but it's technological capabilities that we would consider sometimes as sunset industries already. So we see Chinese companies acquiring printing press makers, which in the US is very much a declining industry, but for China it still has a great value because the newspaper market is still expanding. Or take the recent Wanda AMC transaction, movie theaters. Not many private equity firms would invest in movie theaters in the US, but in China it's such a fast-growing market that's a lot of value, and that's what acquisitions are about, unlocking value. So I think it's important that we distinguish different forms of technological assets, and so they're not really targeting the most advanced biotech patents, but it's really about fairly basic technological innovation capacities, I think.
Okay, we'll start with Andrew.
My question concerns a recent failed deal, and I'm curious to know whether two important aspects of this deal constitute trends in Chinese FDI. This concerns a $1.7 billion deal in California. It was the Treasure Island deal. I guess Lennar Corp and Wilson Meany, some other companies were seeking Chinese investment. I believe it was from the China Development Corporation to build a bunch of housing units on former U.S. Navy land. Like I said, $1.7 billion deal that ultimately failed, apparently for two major reasons. The first was China Development Corp was seeking extensive control over not only contracting but subcontracting, i.e. requiring like Chinese companies rather than U.S. ones perform a lot of the construction and whatnot. The second was apparently IRS concerns that some aspects of the deal seemed a little risky, i.e. there were some issues that I believe the CDC described as, I can't remember what they termed it, but the U.S. was concerned that, or the Wilson Meany and other partners were concerned that those were actually bribes, that bribes were being built into the deal itself. So I'm wondering if those two aspects, the exertion of too much control, which may constitute a discriminatory practice, Professor Shino, that you might have mentioned on one of your slides, and the building of implicit bribes into the contracting structure of the deal constitute trends and possible obstacles for future investment deals in the U.S.
If you want to just comment shortly.
Yeah, great. Well, I don't know specifically the deal. I don't know if it's the China Construction, if it's the China Development Bank, or who the deal it is. But that's actually of the China Development Bank, that's actually very typical of their lending practices in Latin America, where they would require sourcing and other kinds of things. But the point I didn't get to it because of time. But the point I wanted to make in the last slide is that these are precisely the kinds of activities I think that we've got to overcome, and that increasingly a degree of repeatability around deals where the deals do get done in an effective way will define the best practices related specifically as to how the deals will get done. So these kinds of things, as they represent barriers, certainly in this case a hard barrier, will I think define the ability to do these things or not, and then define the way they will be done over time. So I agree. I would certainly agree. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I have to be honest, I didn't follow the reasons for the failure of that deal, but I think one of the major concerns on a political side is that the usual practice of those, it was supposed to be a cross-border loan, so not a direct investment transaction, but the usual concerns are that the Chinese practice usually was that the CDB would lend money, and then the big state-owned enterprises, construction firms, would get the contracting work on the project. which doesn't really work so well in the US context of organized labor and a highly regulatory sophisticated environment like California. So I think that might have played a role in the decision against it. On the IRS bribe side, I didn't really follow that strain, but that goes back to my last point that there are regulatory issues that if you are a partner on the US side, you have a Chinese company that wants to work with you, you got to be sure that they can be held accountable. That there's things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that those corruption patterns, if they arise, are prosecuted and fought. And I think there's still a case to be made that China has to catch up on a lot of those things when it comes to empowering its companies not just to do trade, but to really operate globally. And I think that's what I meant with institutional gap. That there need to be a lot of reforms in corporate governance and institutions to provide that first-class institutional environment for Chinese companies expanding.
We have very limited time, so we'll probably take a couple of questions together. We can start with Abhishek.
My question is to Stephen. What do you see the possibility of CFIUS moving from the perspective of analyzing deals from the perspective of national security issues to moving from that perspective towards more protectionist perspective, as in blocking deals as regards to protectionist measures is concerned?
Just very.
Should we just take one more question and then
So my question is about Chinese capital investing through the United States through private equity. Let's say CIC provides capital to the Blackstone Group, and Blackstone Group acquires, forms a leveraged buyout deal, buying like a defense corporation. Will that be considered a CFIUS filing or those kind of things? It could be it has to be a definition of that. That's what I want to concentrate on.
Sure. The last question first. Is this on?
Is it not on?
Well, the last question first. CFIUS really looks at the substance of the transaction and not at the form. So you're going to ask, are foreign investors, whether Chinese, French, Canadian, are foreign investors at the end of the day in a position to control the company? And if the answer is yes, CFIUS will decide it has jurisdiction, whether that's through private investment, whatever it is, whatever the form. The question is a substantive one. To your question, do I see CFIUS trending in a more protectionist direction? I don't. I think you certainly see protectionist flare-ups on the Hill quite frequently. And that's why when we counsel companies, we tell them, in some cases, you're going to have to think both about CFIUS, which is a more analytical process, and about protectionist issues on the Hill. You may want to talk to the representatives and senators whose constituents are being affected in doing that. So that happens from time to time. I think Chinese companies in particular have become a lot more sophisticated about dealing with the Hill. But I don't see CFIUS trending in that direction. I think they do a pretty good job virtually all the time. There are some exceptions, but virtually all the time of insulating themselves from that sort of nativistic flare-up.
Sadly, we're out of time right now, but all of our panelists are going to be around, so if you would want to come and ask them questions later. Right now, we just want to thank all of our panelists for their time and